Marta! What is this now? Please leave the fuel. The child cannot survive the night.
Any missing fuel from the bakehouse will result in eviction for one family.
Marta grabbed Agnes' wrist as she shoved a peat sack beneath her cloak, suspicion tightening her fingers and setting the whole yard on edge. Agnes, Marta, voice low and hard. What are you doing with that turf? Agnes froze with a small package pressed to her chest. Neighbors froze too. The furtive tug of a peat sack in the shared turf pile was a clear, public theft, and the moment forced the problem into the open. Fuel was running out and people had begun to take themselves first. The yard smelled of cold brick and wet straw. Marta held Agnes' sleeve and saw the dark line of peat dust on her fingers. Suspicion pushed Marta forward. She stepped closer until their coats almost brushed. You can hide it under your cloak, Agnes. Marta, you know there is a rule. We watched the pile together. Agnes' jaw tightened. She would not meet Marta's eyes. A short cuff from the lane cut between them. Elias came up the alley carrying 2 empty lantern frames. He walked like a man who had been standing too long at a counter waiting for bad news. The braziers nearly out, Elias without greeting. The in-1T give credit this month. Marta let go of Agnes and turned to Elias. The three of them exchanged quick looks. Each face showed the same calculation. Whose room would be cold tonight? Marta had been returning from the market with a basket of turnips and a small scrap of coal in her apron. She had planned to leave the coal for the brazier. She had not planned to catch a neighbor stealing. That detail made the present more bitter. Marta's decisions from here would be driven by distrust and a fear of being left without heat. Agnes Elias, if there's not enough in the brazier. We all should know. We should decide together. He set his lantern down and tapped the empty glass. Thomas' stall closes early now. He says he won T-cell on credit. He says times are hard. Marta felt anger sharpen. Thomas regulated who burned what. Thomas controlled the small pile by his stall and the street listened. Agnes' voice was thin. I have a child. I had to take it. I could stand the thought of him shivering. I meant to tell someone later, Marta. I meant to. Marta cut in. You meant to what? Marta, hide it and leave the rest to freeze. She Marta's name firmly. Marta's speech had a clipped rhythm. The neighbors in the lane watched the words. Suspicions moved into accusation. Agnes backed away and the cloak slipped. A corner of the peat bag fell free and dark crumbs scattered on the cobbles. The sound of peat on stone made Elias step forward. This starts fights, Elias. It starts barters and bargains behind closed doors. He rubbed the bridge of his nose and his breath came out as a quick, visible cloud. They hurried to Thomas' stall under low roof and a bare lamp. Thomas opened the shutters with a metal bar and stood framed by the narrow square of lamplight. He wore the same threadbare waistcoat he always wore. Marta noticed the slate of his face and the neatness of the coins looped in a small pouch at his belt. Marta, Thomas' name first. Thomas, Marta, can you sell us coal? Any credit? Thomas' mouth made a small line. He leaned on his counter and showed the guarded pile he kept behind a slat. Thomas's voice was careful. No credit this month, he said. I would have sustained anyone else if I didn't keep some to sell. I need to feed my own stove. I have a ledger. He pushed a small book across the counter like an argument. Thomas kept his hands deliberately visible. I cannot give it away, he said. Elias moved closer. Thomas, Elias, there are children. The brazier is cold. Someone must move. He spoke Elias' name as a kind of appeal. Thomas' brow showed a small flicker of something like guilt. I can sell at a loss. Thomas, I am barely keeping my stall. He measured each word. Words hardened into an urgent plan. Back in Marta's kitchen, the three tested old remedies. Marta shoved a foot, stove, an iron box with hot coals, beneath a bench and set a thick blanket over it. Agnes draped a spare curtain across the doorway to keep the draught from the corridor. Elias held a candle over a pot of water to warm it for the younger child's nightcap. Each action showed different choices. One kept a few warm inches, one tried to seal space, one tried to serve the child. We could crowd into the inn's back room, Marta suggested. Speaking Marta's name with the weight of the idea, share bodies for heat. We take a shift at watching embers, her voice dropped low, precise. The idea carried shame for some and safety for others. Agnes' hands clenched. Elias let out a short, breathy laugh and said, "Going to a common bed is a shame for some. It's a shame for me to sleep in a room that is not mine. But it would be warm," he Elias' name for clarity. Agnes hesitated. "They will look at me strange if I come in with a wet shawl and a child. Thomas will think me less respectable." Marta reached for Agnes' hand and squeezed. The touch said more than a sentence. The room held that small physical exchange, as if it might measure the change of the neighborhood. Thomas' name came back into the conversation when Elias, "If Thomas won T-cell, we must do something else." Marta felt anger shift into calculation. She unhooked a small iron poker and tapped the brazier's rim as if testing the metal for an answer. Her jaw set. Late that night Elias walked to Thomas' back shed. He moved with a purpose that looked like resolve. Marta stayed in the lane with Agnes and the child. The sky showed no moon. Elias pressed himself against the shed door and felt the wood for weakness. The sound of his fingers on the latch made Marta's breathing quicken. Elias' knocking was urgent. Thomas opened the door with a single swing and kept a light inside. "Elias, it's late." "Thomas." The stall-keeper's voice showed irritation. Elias put his palm flat on the frame and spoke in a low, fast manner. "Thomas, we've come together. The brazier's almost out. Can you spare a bit?" "Elias." The knock moved into bargaining. "Thomas, I told you, no credit. I have to sell it. I can't just give it away." He shut the door. The small, final click turned into a pivot point. Elias stepped around the corner to the back. Marta, who had followed in the dark, saw a side window with a weak lamp behind its glass. Elias found a way under the shutter and slipped inside. There was a muffled shout. Marta pushed at the shed's back gate and found it unlatched. She held the latch with both hands and pushed the door. Inside the shed was a small, hot smell of oil and stored dust. Coal sat in neat sacks, more than the pile Thomas had shown in the street. Elias's voice rose. "There is more here. Thomas, how much have you kept?" His question landed like a stone. Marta grabbed at a sack and felt its weight. It was heavier than necessary for one household. Thomas stood framed by the doorway. "Hands up, I kept enough to last me through the month," he said, "and I kept a little extra in case the price rose. I could sell tomorrow for more." His tone had the coldness of someone who had laid plans. Anger returned as a hot spike. Marta's reply was immediate. "You kept what we needed," she said. "You sold the rest. You will not starve if you sell a sack. Thomas, you know the brazier will die without help." She Marta's name in a firm way that left no room for him to dodge. Thomas's shoulders hardened. "You don't know my debts," he said. "You don't know how I must keep my stall for my sister's medicine." He used Thomas' name and the detail of a sister's need. That claim shifted the room's moral balance. For a moment, the neighbors hesitated. Elias stepped forward. "If you hoard, Thomas, you turn our choice into theft by another name," he said. His voice had a sharp edge now. The exchange turned into a tight dialogue. "Thomas, Marta, open the sacks. We'll take only what we need now. We'll not ruin you." Marta's voice tried for reason. Thomas answered quickly. "No, Thomas, I will not be shamed into selling at a loss." He jerked a hand as if to close off the argument. 3 quick lines of back and forth followed. "Thomas, open them." "No." "Thomas, the children." "You don't know my books." The short lines snapped like twine. That argument was the chapter's central clash. Elias made a decision. He moved to lift a sack and wrestled it from its peg. In the scuffle, a small metal brazier that had been resting on a stool rocked. A spark leapt from the braziers coals and caught an old curtain pin to the shed's rafters. The sound was immediate. A tiny hiss, a fresh small flame that found dry cloth. The suddenness changed everything. Smoke swallowed the rafters and made eyes water. Marta barked out orders in a fast, clipped tone. "Get the child!" She cried, "Pull the bedding!" People moved with the speed of a single, shared instinct. Thomas tried to stomp at the flame with his heel. Agnes clutched the child to her chest and bolted for the yard. Elia shoved at a sack to roll it away from the flame. A small hand reached out from the shed's bench. A child's foot slid off the bench and landed in a rush of hair and shawl. Marta grabbed the child's wrist and hauled him free. "Marta!" Elias shouted. The exclamation rode a short sentence. Marta turned her face to the street and saw neighbors lifting charred blankets and yanking out a bundle of clothes. A man across the lane used his coat as a short fire blanket and beat down the small flame until the rafters only smoldered. They coughed and spit black grit. The child clung to Agnes and whimpered. Marta held the child's cheek and counted the breaths. The group moved with one focus: rescue. Thomas stood with soot on his shirt and his eyes wet. He pointed to a crate where a small tin chest sat. "My sister's pills," he said in a voice that had become small. "They re there. I kept that for her. I couldn't he could not finish." A new shift of emotion came through, unmistakable, from anger to exhausted relief. The neighbors set wet clothes to the burned rafters. Elias picked up the child and checked for bruises. Agnes sat with her head in her hands and let someone else wipe soot from her face. Marta, with black smudges on her palms, inspected the embers and felt the last heat of the brazier. At dawn they dragged cushions and benches into the inn's back room. The innkeeper had finally yielded to the sight of smoked curtains and muddy shoes. He opened his door and let them huddle in the near warmth of his hearth. The room smelled of boiled grain and stew. Marta laid out 2 blankets, while Agnes made a small bed for the child on a bench. Elias paced for a moment, then sat heavily and closed his eyes for a short count. The choices they had made sat like physical objects in the room. Thomas cleaned cinders from his shirt and kept stopping to rub a sore spot on his arm. He Thomas in a voice that now carried apology. "I thought I had to keep a little to survive. I thought the price would save me. I miscalculated," he said. His sentences came in short-held measures. Agnes spoke up with a voice that trembled but carried clarity. "I should not have taken the turf without telling anyone. I was ashamed to ask. I thought if I got the child warm, I could wait until later. I see now it made things worse." She Agnes and the child's name as she adjusted the small blanket. Her confession shifted the room again, from blame to tired understanding. Elias put his hand on Thomas' shoulder. It was a single action that replaced an entire argument. "Thomas, Elias, we will find a share. We will make sure your sister's pills are paid for." Elias' voice was steady. The tone changed to planning, concrete and immediate. Marta counted the urns of embers. She watched the brazier because watching embers had become a ritual of survival. She assigned shifts to people for watching heat and checking on the child's breathing. Each instruction was a small act of governance replacing the earlier anger. Marta's earlier suspicion gave way to a different route: duty. That shift showed in how she walked the room, tapping shoulders, checking blankets, and assigning who would sleep where. They bartered items for coal, and a neighbor gave a small basket of dried apples in exchange for 2 handfuls of peat. Thomas handed out a single sack with measured, reluctant hands. He moved with a pace that suggested he had counted his losses and decided to keep his standing in the street rather than his private stash. The choice was concrete and loud in its consequences. Outside the inn window, frost made patterns on the glass. Marta watched a child press a mitten to the pane and exhale a small white puff. Inside, bodies huddled and shared breath and blankets. The inn's back room had become a temporary household where the line between family and neighbor blurred through practical necessity. For a while the room settled into small routines. Someone stirred the stew and set new coals from the single sack to boil a kettle. Agnes hummed a short tune to the child while Marta mended a torn sleeve by lamplight. Each small action replaced the day's conflict with repair. The shift that had moved through suspicion, anger, desperation, and exhaustion now landed on a steady, practical solidarity. Later Thomas took Marta aside and set down a folded scrap of paper. "My ledger shows what I owe," he said. He passed her the page. Marta skimmed it and saw small sums owing for grain, salt, medicine. Thomas stood with his head lowered. "I kept the extra to meet one bill. I misread the timing." "I'm sorry." He spoke Thomas's name again and looked up for acceptance. Marta did not announce mercy. She counted the ledger and then counted the neighbor's needs. She chose to set aside an amount that would ease Thomas' debt and leave enough peat for the communal brazier. That decision was concrete. She tied the small sum of coins to a sack of coal and gave it to Thomas with specific instructions for distribution. "You will sell this and buy only what we need. Marta, you will not raise the price for us this winter." Her words were not a sermon. They were a precisely stated transaction. The day lightened. Men and women stirred and stretched stiff limbs. The child's face was pinking from warmth. People moved with the mechanical grace of those who had been woken too soon and worked until late. Conversations were short and purposeful. They planned shifts to watch embers and named who would report to the brazier at dusk. In the inn's kitchen, an exhausted silence settled into a practical calm. Marta set the last warming pan on the stove and watched the flame flare once, then settle. She felt her hands tremble slightly from the night's exertion, and she rubbed the pads of her fingers together. That small physical response marked the cost of choices. Before they left the room, they all agreed on one rule: watch the embers, do not hoard, call when the brazier fails. They wrote no formal pledge. The agreement took the form of actions to be followed. Agnes promised to speak if she ever needed a peat sack. Thomas promised to open his ledger to a neighbor chosen for oversight. Elias agreed to carry wood from the next town's consignments on fair shares when he could. Marta stood at the inn's door and felt a cold edge of morning air. She pulled her thin wool scarf closer and counted the people inside the room with a small inward ledger of her own. The count matched the decision. They had chosen safety over some small pride. Each person had paid in sweat or guilt or suit. The final scene of the chapter was small and specific. Marta picked up a damp bundle of charred bedding and laid it on the brazier's rim to finish burning. She pushed the last smoldering coal into the brazier, then closed the inn's back door with both hands. The door's latch clicked. The sound was ordinary, decisive, and complete. Calm narrator observed the practical arrangements and the exhausted compassion that followed the fire. The community would keep a closer watch next winter. They had learned where hoarding began and where rescue took over. The lesson stayed in an action: a closed door, a counted sack, a shift roster posted on a scrap of wood. The chapter ends as they move to sleep together, bodies warm enough for the night, and eyes heavy from the work they had done. A turf slipped from Agnes' apron and Marta's hand closed on her wrist before the oven master could step between them. Suspicion rose in Marta like a sharp intake of breath. She named it inwardly and let it steer her next step. "Agnes." Marta, voice low but hard, "What are you doing with that turf?" The oven cue stilled. Heat from the oven washed over waiting faces, while the village's shortage of fuel hardened into a single, accusing moment. Marta had not meant to speak so loud. She had come that evening for bread only. The communal bakehouse line curled along the yard, shoulders hunched against a wet wind. Thomas, the overseer, stood by the oven with his arms folded. He held the iron peel like a judge's gavel. Marta's palm tightened on Agnes' wrist, and she felt the small bones beneath the apron. Suspicion pushed her to act. Suspicion had led her here and would force her hand if she let it. Agnes froze, a smear of flour on her cheek, one hand pressed to her belly where Lina's thin blanket showed beneath the apron. The peat turf peered out like contraband. Around them, people pressed forward, eyes turning. Helka's mouth opened, then shut. Someone muttered, and the sound ran along the line like wind through rope. Thomas stepped forward. "Explain yourself," he said. "That turf is for the oven," his voice carried. He pushed his chin at Agnes. "You know the rules. You know the ration." Thomas' rhythm was clipped, the way he measured the peel against the bread's rim. Marta kept her hold. Her chest felt tight. The crowd needed a name to blame tonight, and she could feel their search for it. Agnes swallowed. Her hands trembled where Marta gripped her wrist. "Lena is burning, Marta," she said. "She has fever. I cannot let her lie cold." Her voice was small but steady. Neighbors looked away or stiffened. Helka moved closer and said sharp, "We all have children. We all count turf. You take from others, and you'll starve all of us. Who will feed their oven if you steal?" The line split into murmurs. Marta heard the word thief as if it were a stone dropped in a well. Its ripples reached her. Marta pulled Agnes aside into the narrow service alley beside the bakehouse, away from the oven's heat and the ovenmaster's judgment. Her hand had been steady before. Now it lingered at Agnes' elbow. The cracked plaster of the alley caught the dim lamplight in thin lines. Marta felt the city lean on her chest. Suspicion from neighbors, the constable's recent rounds, the rumor of hoarders. She had learned how quickly a face could change in this town. "Tell me the truth, Marta." Her voice softened but did not lose its edge. "Tell me how long Lena has been burning." Suspicion bent toward care in that question. Marta wanted both to know if Agnes had been reckless and to see whether the child's fever deserved theft. Agnes's eyes filled. "2 nights, she said. She shakes and will not eat. I took the turf after dusk yesterday, when no one was watching. I wrapped it in my apron and walked. I could not sleep, Marta. I could not watch her turn black at the lips." Her hands clenched the apron. She spoke quick, each sentence a rush of small, concrete facts. Linus temperature, the herbs tried and wasted, the empty purse. Marta felt a second shift. Suspicion edged into something tighter, nearer to pity. Her jaw softened. She had seen Lena once at market, a narrow child with a cough that sounded like a wet wedge against a door. Marta had kept her distance then. Now up close, she saw the way Agnes's fingers left flour dust on her wrist, as if she had not noticed. The alley smelled of ash and wet straw. Marta's instincts moved from accusation to calculation. They heard boots on the yard stones. Constable Gregor arrived with his lantern and a ledger under his arm. He had been making rounds about recent turf thefts, collecting names with a slow, deliberate pen. He nodded at Thomas and asked, "What's happened here?" His voice carried authority but not anger. He was the kind who treated law like a tool. Thomas pointed. "Agnes was caught with turf meant for the bake. We saw her take it." He spoke quick, like a man stacking cord. Marta stayed quiet. She watched the constable's eyes move over her, then rest briefly on the seam of her skirts. Marta felt the rumor Helka had spread curl closer. Someone hoards turf. She could hear Helka just behind Gregor, letting that thought fall into place. Helka's voice rose. "Someone hides more than they claim. Who keeps warm while the rest shiver." She circled their small group. Her accusation landed on Marta with the same weight as the constable's ledger. Marta's fingers tightened. She felt another emotion, shame, quick and hot. Shame came from 2 places, from being suspected and from holding a secret she had kept to herself. Gregor's pen scratched. "Names, please," he said, voice steady. He listed those present and looked toward Marta. Marta's stomach bowed inward. She thought of the small bundle she had hidden beneath a loose board at home, a neat wrap of turf tied with twine. She had meant to ration it, to keep some for the worst nights. She had planned to use it only when her own mother needed warmth. The idea of hoarding sounded cruel, said aloud. She felt the crowd searching her for proof. An outside event arrived then. A neighbor's shout from the lane. Someone had found a scrap of turf near the creek where the cart tracks ran. People craned to see. The discovery moved suspicion like a hand moving pieces on a board. Thomas' jaw tightened. Gregor glanced toward the lane. Helga's eyes brightened. Marta made a choice. She led the way toward her house rather than wait for the constable to order searches. Her gait was quick. She kept her head down. Inside her small kitchen, the floorboards gave a thin, hollow sound under her stool. Marta crouched and pried up the loose board. The neat bundle of turf lay wrapped in oilcloth, darker at one end where peat dust had rubbed through. The discovery was private, sudden, and it changed the public moment into a personal one. Gregor followed, face tight. Neighbors pressed to the doorway. Marta could feel their breath as clearly as winter wind. Thomas stayed back, holding the peel like a rod. Helga leaned forward, eyes bright. "I told you," she said. "She hides it. She takes and hides." The accusation landed like a slap against plaster. Marta held the turf in both hands and felt its weight as if it were a verdict. Marta could have denied it. She could have hidden her cash further and argued that the turf was for her sick mother or a favor from a neighbor. Instead, she felt a different shift of feeling, from shame into resolve. Her voice was low. "Take it," she said to Gregor. She handed over most of the bundle, the larger half tied in a second cloth. "Take it to Aigen's for Lina. Use the rest for the bakehouse. Keep whatever records you need. I will not argue tonight." The choice cut through the crowd's search for blame and offered a new image: sacrifice in place of theft. There was a small, surprised movement from Aigen's. She stepped forward, hands out. "Marta, no," she said, voice trembling. "You do not have to." Marta shook her head. "Aigen's, your child comes first. I will not have a woman die warm alone because neighbors counted wrong." Her words were short and plain. People listened. Gregor hesitated. His pen paused over the ledger. He looked at Marta and then at the parcel. He could have taken names. He could have arrested and fined. Instead, he slid the larger cloth, wrapped turf into his lantern, lit bag and closed it. "I'll note this down," he said, "but I am delaying formal action for now. You all will be recorded. We must see how the bakehouse reports its rationing tomorrow." He looked at Thomas next. Thomas bent his head and rubbed his thumb along the iron peel's shaft. Helga scowled but did not press. A change moved the crowd. Relief and lingering scorn mixed on their faces like soot and flour. Agnes's knees almost gave. Marta reached and steadied her with a flat palm on the elbow. "Agnes." Marta softly. "Go. Bring Lina back, and do not stop until the child sleeps." Agnes's mouth opened and closed. She lifted the turf bundle as if it had gained weight and left without looking back. The alley afterward held a different pace. People drifted away. Thomas remained for a few minutes and then helped shift the oven's coals with an easy motion that spoke of routine more than victory. Helga stayed and stirred gossip into the night air with a slow, sharp voice. Marta sat on the stoop and rubbed her wrists where line grit had left a mark. Shame shifted into a quiet steadiness. She had paid a private cost in the public square. Her standing in the community had changed. Some eyes warmed, some cooled. That night Marta spread a thin cloth over the remaining embers in her courtyard brazier. A small group gathered. Thomas, Helga, and two others who had lingered. They placed their palms near the heat. Someone cracked a crust of bread and passed it around. The share was small, the warmth smaller. Marta let the embers call them close. There was a certain softness in accepting the crowd's warmth rather than hiding it. Helga spoke first into the small circle. "You wasted the town's turf," she said. Her voice was steady, not vicious. "You put us at risk. We ration because the winter was worse this year." Her tone had an edge, but also a flatness. Marta answered plainly, "I know. I counted nights. I decided a child's life mattered more than the measure of turf. I will live with what you say, but Lina slept last night." She did not shiver in a thin blanket. The words landed as evidence, not sermon. Thomas, who had watched the oven's rhythm all his life, said, "Rations break when people hide. Rations also fail when we count and do not see a fever for what it is. Marta, you did a thing no law can measure well." I will speak to the oven master about making a small allowance when a child's fever is shown. But that will need proof." He paused. "We can find proof. A neighbor's word, a child's cough heard. We need a slow, steady way to add cases." His voice moved from accusation to practical policy. The group listened and shifted. Marta felt another pivot inside her, from shame into a sense of pragmatic agency. She could accept blame or she could work the rules. "Bring me Lina's blanket tomorrow," she said. "I'll show Thomas the child's cough. If we keep a note, then someone else won't have to steal in the dark." Helka blinked. Thomas's brow smoothed. The conversation moved from personal punishment to communal fix. A new event came. A child's long, dry cough echoed from the lane. Agnes had returned, carrying Lina, who made a small wheeze at each breath. The group rose and spread a closer circle. Marta knelt and let the child rest at her knees. She felt the child's skin warm and damp, and adjusted the blanket. The concrete action of tending a child held the town's attention better than words. Neighbors offered what they could. Thomas brought a cup of thin broth. Helka fetched a scrap of wool. Someone else produced a small pestle of herbs. They pressed them into lines of movement. Spoon, cloth, hand on forehead. The gestures were practical. They held less of moral pronouncement than of survival. Marta watched Agnes as she fed the child the broth. Agnes' hands trembled but did not drop. The village's earlier suspicion seemed to loosen into something more complicated. People whispered in undertones. Some scolded in quieter ways, others muttered their own confessions. A few admitted to hiding a little turf in lean months. The admission broke the neat line of blame. It was a small twist. The crowd's hunt for a single thief became a discovery that many had taken a common bending of rules under hard weather. By the time the braziers' lights sank lower, the constable had recorded names and left with a promise to watch the records. Thomas had agreed to note urgent needs when a child or elder presented. Helka still had a hard line in her voice, but less heat. Marta kept her sleeves rolled down, hiding the scratch from the oven cue. She had given away most of her cash and kept only a sliver under the hearth to see her own mother through the next dusk. The night's last movement was small. Marta stepped to the doorway and listened. The lane was quiet save for the soft sound of boots and the occasional cough. A neighbor closed a shutter. Someone swept straw off the threshold. The brazier hissed once and then settled into a dim tone. Marta's hands were warm from tending. The emotion that had driven her in that yard, suspicion, had moved through pity and shame and settled as a quiet resolve to act differently. She did not pretend the matter was closed. The constable would record the incident. Helka's gossip would carry. The oven's rationing might change or it might not. But the immediate need had been met. Agnes had turf for Lina. Marta's neighbors had seen the choice. That mattered here. Decisions were small and public and could alter a standing as surely as theft. Before she closed the kitchen slatch, Marta looked once at the loose board where the turf had been hidden. She slid her finger along the seam and felt the slight give in the wood. The board matched the plank across the way. She pressed it back in place and ran her palm along its edge until the grain fell even. The action told her what her words could not. She had traded privacy for a child's breath. The final, concrete sound of the chapter came as a soft knock on the lane's gate. Someone came to check on Lina, walking with purpose through the cold. The knock echoed and then was followed by a small, steady tread away. Marta paused, hearing the step and feeling the brazier's last warmth sink into the soil. The night's dispute had settled into practical acts. The alley kept the smell of peat and bread, and Marta closed the door with hands that had made a choice and would live with it. Agnes slid a coin into Jory's palm and Marta's fingers closed on Agnes' wrist. Suspicion tightened Marta's jaw as she pulled Agnes back beneath the guttered lamp. The wharf stank of river silt and coal. Men shifted their weight on wet boards. Voices fell to hushed, urgent murmurs. Marta breathed and did not let go. She had been watching Jory for 3 nights. She had felt the thread of gossip at the oven queue, the way coins disappeared at dusk. That suspicion shaped her hands now. It moved her to step forward. It moved her to reveal what Agnes hoped to hide. Agnes. Marta, voice low and quick. Give it here. Agnes tried to pull free Marta. Jory's eyes flicked to Marta. He kept one hand on the sack at his hip. His mouth was tight. He nothing. A lantern hung above the quay and threw a ring of yellow on damp planks. The coin sat cold and heavy in Agnes' palm. Neighbors had drifted close. A man with a tar-stained cap folded his arms. A woman holding a child leaned forward, knuckles white on the child's shoulder. No one spoke. No one moved to stop Marta. Agnes' fingers tightened around the coin. She pressed it between her teeth as if to hide it. Marta felt the heat of that small, quick motion. Marta felt the same small desperation in Agnes that Marta had seen in the oven queue the week before, when a turf slipped from Agnes' apron and hands had reached for it. The memory sharpened Marta's caution. She imagined Agnes' home with no embers, a child shivering under thin blankets. That image made her pull harder. Marta, please. Agnes. Her voice was nearly a whisper. It's only one turf. Only enough for Thomas and the child. Only one turf, Marta repeated. She eased her grip to look Agnes in the face. You knew what this meant. You knew the levy. Agnes glanced at Jory. She mouthed a name without sound and then pushed her chin toward the canal. She was asking for something without saying it. Jory stepped forward. No trouble for me, he said. You know my price. A bell clanged from the bakehouse across the yard, thin and final. The sound dragged the crowd's attention away from the wharf and toward the notice board near the stair. Someone muttered about the new levy. Marta kept her hand on Agnes' wrist and let the murmurs become a cheek against her shoulder. She could not release Agnes. Not yet. The posted notice changed the mood. Neighbors pressed their faces close, reading the bolded lines about higher fuel levies. A woman named Beatrice hissed. It's worse than we feared. A boy handed the paper down the stair like a secret. The notice made private needs public. It made the furtive trade at the wharf into evidence of survival. Marta heard names passed in low tones, names of those assigned extra rations, names of landlords who would not tolerate theft. The notice meant risk. It shifted the entire street into a ledger of who could pay and who could not. At the bottom of the stair, the oven master waited where he always waited. Hands stained with flour, shoulders set with the steady weight of the community oven. He read the notice too. He pinched the bridge of his nose and then looked up at the gathered crowd. Fuel will be cut further. He announced, from next week the allotment falls by a quarter. Those who steal will be reported. A murmur rose and then a cry. Agnes sucked in a breath so sharp Marta heard it like a struck tin. Thomas, when he appeared beside Agnes a moment later, put his hand on her back and did not speak. He wore his work apron, smudged with soot. Beatrice pushed through the cluster of people. She was older than the women in the queue and moved with a cautious firmness. Oven master, she said, there are children to feed. We will find a way. The oven master's face did not soften. He looked at the ledger box beside his knee, and then at the crowd. I will try, Beatrice. I will try. But the landlord has ordered strict accounts. My hands are tied. A hush settled. The ledger lay open, pages scored with ledger ink and coal dust. Marta put a thumb to one torn page, feeling the imprint of numbers that dictated who would warm their bread and who would watch their loaves grow cold. Anger slid across the group like a current. People reached for one another, exchanged looks. Some fingered coins. Others touched the hems of cloaks. The oven master rubbed his forearm and then nodded to Marta, a small, tired concession. Back in the tenement stair, a neighbor shoved a scrap of damp paper toward Agnes. The scrap was a list, names, times, and an odd scribble that hinted at who had extra turf. Marta leaned in and read the handwriting. Jory's name was there, circled. He marks houses. Marta. Her voice was low and hoarse. He marks the homes. Beatrice's eyes went flat. He trades for a favor and then sells the ledger. A woman in the stair spoke up. We can keep hiding from each other. The landlord will take someone if it continues. Agnes looked away. Thomas squeezed her hand. The pair walked down the lane toward the communal bakehouse with a small, steady step, as if they could keep the world at bay by moving through it together. Inside the bakehouse, heat wrapped the room in a thin, dusty comfort. The oven's door glowed like a dull eye. Villagers clustered near the bench, pressed together for warmth while the oven master worked the dough. He spoke without theatrics. "We will ration more strictly," he said. "You will take less. You will not hide fuel." Hands rose in protest. "A woman named lies. We will freeze. There's no wood left in my yard." Her voice slipped into a plea. Another man, Thomas, said, "I can give up my turn to bake." "Take mine." The oven master shook his head. "If the ledger shows theft, the landlord will evict the worst offenders. I have a wife and a child to cover. I cannot risk my house." He tapped the ledger with a flour-dusted finger. Marta watched this and felt alarm slide into anger. She watched the oven master choose his ledger over neighbor warmth and felt betrayed. That was a second shift. Suspicion to alarm to betrayal. She had come to the wharf to stop a petty theft. She had not expected to see the bakehouse ledger become a weapon. A man near the door pressed a palm against his chest and said, "What will we do for the widow on Cross Lane?" "She cannot climb stairs to buy peat," Beatrice answered. "We rotate. Agnes and Thomas can take turns with her. We will share the foot warmers." Agnes's shoulders tightened. She looked straight at Marta. "We can lend Beatrice the turf if you will not say anything, Marta. She will sleep with us tomorrow." The plan formed quietly. They would hide a single turf beneath floorboards. They would invite old widow Beatrice to sleep between Agnes and Thomas. They would press bodies together under blankets to borrow heat. The acts were practical and intimate. They changed the shape of the household. "It will be cramped, Thomas, but the child will have legs warm enough to sleep." Agnes nodded and then laughed once. A short huff that held too much. "It is not pride that moves us now," she said. "It is need." Marta watched them. She felt a pull to help, then paused because she knew that helping meant exposure. If anyone learned the turf came from the wharf, someone would be punished. If the ledger showed a missing turf, the oven master could not hide it forever. That night, Marta slipped out after the group dispersed. She followed the narrow alley toward the canal, keeping to the shadows of low buildings. She kept at least 3 steps behind Jory. She did not call out. She kept her hand near her coat pocket, where she carried a small brass lamp. Jory moved with a small, practiced gait. He ducked under a low eave, walked past a stack of bundles, and then stopped at a stone arch where the water pooled black. Marta crouched behind a barrel and watched. 2 men stood under the arch when Jory arrived. One wore a heavy coat and a ribbon that marked him as an agent of the landlord. The other carried a ledger rolled in oilcloth. Jory moved close and slid a sack from his hip. Marta tightened her fingers on the lamp handle. She did not call out. She did not move. She watched Jory hand over the sack, and then watched the agent thumb coins and nod. The agent's face held no shame. He tucked the sack beneath his coat, and then kneed the ledger to his side. The sight hit Marta like a hard strike. Her chest went tight, her jaw set. Betrayal flared into something hot and violent. She crept forward, and then stepped out of shadow. "Jory, Marta." Her voice was low and sharp. "Why are you handing out our names?" Jory's head snapped up. He put his hand to his coat as if to hide the missing turf. The agent reached for the ledger. The man with the ribbon said, "Keep your voice down, woman. This is business." Marta did not step back. She felt the Alice cold press at her cheek. "Business." She repeated, "You mark us for the landlord, and we pay for the price." A hard laugh escaped Jory. "You have your turf regardless. I get a coin and I stay out of trouble. Who loses?" Marta's hands moved before she could plan. She lunged for the ledger. The agent shoved her. Jory swung a sack at her shoulder. The leather thudded. Marta staggered and then reached for the sack. She wanted to tear it from Jory's arms. She wanted to find the turf and shove it back to Agnes. The alley turned into a scrape of limbs and cursed breaths. Marta bit her hand on a rung of cold metal and tasted iron. Jory's elbow hit her temple. The agent's boot aimed for Marta's shin. She went down onto wet cobbles and rolled, feeling the scrape of stone through her coat. From the corner, a voice yelled, "Stop it!" It was Thomas. He had followed Marta without saying so. Thomas's bulk fell across Jory's back. He grabbed the sack. Agnes had appeared at the mouth of the alley too, hair loose, voice split open. "Let it be," Agnes shouted. "We will not hand him to the landlord." "He is one of ours, Agnes," Marta gasped. She looked at Thomas. He was straining to hold Jory while the agent tried to pull him free. The sack slipped from Jory's grasp and tumbled toward the canal. Turf burst free from its neck and rolled across wet stones. For a beat, no one moved. Then a hand reached, and the turf slid toward the water. Marta saw the whole thing as if in a single, terrible mapping. Choice had narrowed to 2 acts. If the turf slipped into the canal, the family would lose its only fuel. If Marta or Thomas or Agnes held on, they would be the ones named in a ledger. Marta moved faster than thought. She caught the turf with a scraped knuckle. She shoved it into her coat. The action was a decision. It sealed a small betrayal of rules for a larger loyalty to a child's night. Jory spat and twisted free. He ran, curses swallowed by the night. The agent cursed him back and then adjusted his coat, smoothing the ledger under his arm. The agent's face was calm and flat with official certainty. He stepped away and then put a hand to his mouth as if to whistle. He did not. He had what he needed: lists, names, and a man to blame if proof ever surfaced. At the quay edge, neighbors pulled back and then crowded forward with urgent hands. The ovenmaster limped up, cheeks pale from exertion. Marta stood with the turf pressed between her ribs. She felt every bruise along her hip and the sting at her scalp where Jory's elbow had found bone. Agnes touched Marta's sleeve. "You could have been killed," she said. "You could have been taken." Marta looked at her. She felt a change within her that was not regret. It was a calm that was heavy with purpose. The alley fight had changed her fear into a poor sort of determination. She had decided which side she would keep. They moved at once to conceal evidence. The ovenmaster took the turf from Marta with a hand that trembled and then placed it inside his flour box. He closed the lid and left it under sacks of grain. He wiped his palms on his apron and then found the missing tally in the ledger and altered a figure with a blunt stick dipped in coal dust. Agnes and Marta carried a small heap of damp peat to the kitchen. There they stuffed it into a brazier and set wet rags around the chimney to keep the smoke low. They lit it despite the smell that would travel up the stair. Smoke crawled into the rafters and then stung the eyes. Old widow Beatrice arrived at the attic step that night with a small basket and a stoop that made her shoulders level. Thomas opened the door. He lifted Beatrice's chin and said, "Come in." "There's room." Beatrice stepped inside and saw the child curled under a thin blanket. She gave a short, surprised laugh and then set her basket down. "You could have asked us sooner," she said. "I would have come." Agnes helped Beatrice into the bed and then slid under the blanket beside her husband. The 3 of them tucked together like a stack of rough cloth. The child's small legs found warmth between arms. The breath in the room slowed and then matched. Outside, the alley had calmed. Jory's shadow passed once through the lane and then vanished. The agent's ledger stayed in his coat. The ovenmaster avoided mention of the missing turf and kept his ledger closed. At dawn, a few households gathered at a single brazier on the corner. They cupped hands over the ember and passed a tin cup of weak tea. Faces showed wear. Eyes were ringed from smoke and sleeplessness. Agnes handed a thin slice of bread to Beatrice. "Tomorrow," she said, "we will trade who sleeps where. We will keep the child warm." Beatrice took the bread and nodded. Marta watched them. She kept her hand on the patched coat she wore. Her knuckles were still raw. She thought of the ledger rolled in oilcloth and the agent's neutral face. She thought of Jory's small, frightened grin when someone handed him a coin. Something had changed on the quay. The list that recorded who was warm and who was cold had teeth beyond the oven master's ledger. There were other ledgers now, kept by people who preferred orders to neighbor warmth. The change made survival a contest instead of a shared labor. Marta pressed the damp turf into the floorboard beneath Agnes' bed. She hammered the board down with a flat stone so no one would see the seam. She placed a scrap of cloth over the nail to hide it. Then she whispered, "We will not be the ones who lose a child to cold." Agnes answered only with a small sound, and then turned her face into the blanket. Thomas lay with his arm over Agnes for a long time, breathing slow and steady. Beatrice dozed and then woke, and then dozed again. When the sun came up thinly over the water, neighbors drifted to work with their coats tucked close. The oven master kept the ledger closed. He moved as always, measured and careful. Jory did not show his face in the yard. The agent walked the lane with a straight back and a ledger under his arm. Marta walked home with sore ribs and a decision in her chest. She had pulled a turf from the quay. She had made a choice that would mark her if the ledger was ever pried open. She had also protected a child's night. A week later, there was another scuffle at the bakehouse. Names were spoken aloud in anger. The landlord called for account. Still, no one at the stair mentioned who had taken the turf. They kept their mouths shut. They kept their embers low and their hands warm. Marta thought of the ledger under the agent's coat. She thought of Jory and the sack that had tumbled. She felt the full arc of the choices they'd all made. The small theft at the wharf, the posted notice on the stair, the oven master's threatened ledger, the compact in a cramped bed. Those actions had braided together into a fragile night of warmth. At dawn after the scuffle, Marta joined the small group at the corner brazier. She took a tin cup, held it close, and felt the heat creep into her palms. Agnes handed Thomas a fresh loaf. Beatrice hummed a tune under her breath while she broke bread. The moment was not triumph. It was careful breathing after a fight. Marta's suspicion had carried them into danger. It had then changed into a fierce loyalty that reached for a turf in the dark. The ledger remained. The agent still walked. Jory still sold names. But for that night, for one child's sleep, they had traded paperwork for warmth. The chapter closed with the small, concrete action that had begun it. Marta set the stone aside after nailing the floorboard. She pressed her fingers into the seam to feel the hidden turf beneath. She whispered to no one, "Keep warm." Someone knocked at the oven door that morning, asking for a list of names. Marta stayed silent. The wood in the brazier had burned low and then glowed. They would trade warmth again, with bargains and with choices. For now the child slept, leg muscles relaxed in the heat, and the turf was where Marta had placed it. A hard knock rattled the thin stair and Marta's hand closed on a small sack the moment Agnes slid it beneath the pollet. "Keep it down," Agnes mouthed. One shoulder pressed to the rafters as she shoved the turf with the heel of her palm. Suspicion narrowed Marta's eyes. She let her fingers curl around the sack and waited for sound from the stair again. By the third knock, a neighbor at the doorway gave a soft cough, and the attic filled with the tense, careful breathing of people who had been taught to listen for more than footsteps. The problem was simple and immediate. Fuel was scarce. The landlord checked stores at dawn, and if the sack was discovered, the whole room might lose the little shelter they had. Marta's choice that night would be shaped by suspicion, and that suspicion would move her hands and her voice long before reason did. Marta did not speak at once. She let the knock press against her ribs and let Agnes's fingers, pale in the candlelight, tremble where they clutched the pollet board. Marta had seen this exact motion before, a turf tucked away, a furtive exchange, the way Agnes's jaw worked when she hid things. She remembered pulling at Agnes's wrist earlier that week in the bakehouse, the yard going quiet when the sack almost slipped free of Agnes's apron. Marta had gripped that wrist until the woman stopped moving. that memory pinched at Marta's elbow now and pushed her toward action. If the landlord found fuel under their pallet, it would be taken for the morning bake, and they would have nothing. Marta eased forward and, without a word, slid a second hand beneath the pallet to cover the peat already half hidden there. Agnes exhaled a sound that could have been relief or shame. "Marta," she whispered. "Not a word. Marta, wait." The voice from below came again. This time it carried the scrape of a heavy boot on wood and the landlord's coarse call. "Anyone awake? I need light in the bakehouse." Outside, someone coughed. Inside, a child shifted in sleep, and a small groan came from the pallet where an old woman tried to keep her knees from creaking. Marta tightened her fingers on the turfs and felt the rough press of peat beneath her palm like a small accusation. They had bargained for heat before. Marta remembered Agnes sliding a coin into Jory's palm at the wharf, and how Marta had seized the woman's wrist in public so the whole queue could watch. Suspicion and shame had both been visible in that exchange. Now those earlier trades sat in the corner of Marta's mind and pushed her forward. She could imagine the oven master's inspection already, his lamp circling, his nose seeking the charcoal scent that would betray them. If he took the peat for the morning bake, the room would lose what little warmth the embers could bring until the next ration came. Marta had to decide quickly what to show and what to hide. She slid a bucket of cold water near the pallet and moved a blanket so its frayed edge covered the peat burlap. Agnes shoved the candle farther back. "Marta." "I'll do it," Agnes answered, voice tight. A thin beam of lamplight from the corridor passed along the ceiling joists and revealed the dust motes like small sails. Marta watched them and did not mistake them for movement. Steps came into the landing, slower now, and the oven master's boot tapped the threshold in a way that suggested he expected bargains and small thefts nightly. He was a tall man with soot under his nails, a man who had once guided Doph with a thumb and now guided accounts with a ledger. His inspection would not be kind. The oven master pushed the door and his lamp spit a round pool of light across the attic floor. He did not speak at first. He sniffed, and this made the room twist as everyone tried to be less visible. "Morning all," he said finally, voice like gravel. "I'll not stay. Fuel tali. Any spare?" Neighbors shuffled. A man at the far pallet lifted his head, then dropped it. Marta moved toward the doorway, keeping her hands above the pallet, but away from the uncertain burlap where peat slumped. She kept her face flat, the way she had been taught to keep it when debts were tallied and no one offered more. "Marta," the oven master said, naming her directly now. "You've been in my list twice this month. Any coal set aside. I need it for the morning bake." Marta's first reaction was a flash of anger at the ledger, at the cold mathematics that counted bodies as coal units. Then another emotion took over. Calculation. She traded anger for a measured nod and replied, "None to spare, master. We used what little we had last night." Her voice was low. She kept the consonants soft to avoid drawing the landlord's attention from the stare. Agnes's fingers dug into the hem of her skirt. She did not speak, but her eyes named what Marta had said as false. The peat under the pallet pressed against Marta's knuckles and threatened to betray them with every tiny movement. After the oven master left the landing with a grumble about accounting, a different sound arrived. A child's cough from the corner where a small figure had been flickering with fever. The room shifted from simple concealment to urgent need. A neighbor lifted the blanket, and the child's face was pink and hot. Someone brushed their hand over the child's hair and hissed the name. "Edda." That quick revelation moved suspicion into fear. Marta felt a new direction to her decisions. She thought of the earlier bargain, Jory's coin pressed into Agnes' palm, and how bargains had always come with conditions. Warmth had been a thing to trade, to borrow, to buy with favors or pride. Jory, a broad, shouldered man with a jut of a chin, stepped forward from the doorway where he had been listening. His voice was low. "Coins here, for coal, but I want work in return. I want you to mend my net, Marta. He looked at her and then at the child. Marta paused. She knew Jory. He measured need in obligation and could be cold when the ledger did not balance for him. Jory Marta, and the name tightened into a short command. What would you do if you had less than I do? He bristled. I work, I ask. I keep my family from freezing. He held the coin out. In his fingers it looked paler than the lamplight. Agnes' mouth moved. Take it, she said. Take it for the child. Marta's suspicion shifted again, now toward the terms themselves. This was not only about fuel. It was about who could demand labor and who could demand dignity. She thought of the night bargains earlier. Agnes slipping coin to Jory at the wharf while Marta had held the woman's wrist. Of furtive hands and public shame. Now there was a child burning with fever, and a man who wanted a net repaired in exchange for warmth. Marta looked at the coin, then at Eda's clenched fingers. She made a choice that tightened the room. Jory, you will have the coal when the child is well. For now, tell me what you want mended and I'll do it, but not tonight. We can spare the hands. Jory's jaw worked. He liked transactions immediate and visible. No, he said, I want it done before day's end. I want proof. You will have proof before noon, Marta. A murmur went through the attic. People shifted bedding, noses pressed to the blankets, and the child's cuff sharpened like a small bell. Agnes touched Marta's arm, a light, pleading pressure. Marta, please. Marta met Agnes' eyes and thought of the peat beneath the pallet, and of the oven-master's lamp, and of Jory's coin. Her next move would be seen by the landlord if the knock came again. It might also set a standard in that small community. Who gave, who took, and at what cost? Dawn smelled of wet wood and old coal when the landlord's heavy step returned. This time he had a torch. The beam cut into the attic as if it were a knife, and the landlord's voice came hard. Open up. I heard movement. The landlord was a man who kept records of housing and had the authority to evict. His torchlight made faces plain and accused. Marta felt the pallet press at her knees and the peat strain against her hand. She had to act now, or watch the landlord carry the peat down the stairs to the bakehouse and leave the child to freeze through the morning. Someone in the corner, a neighbor named Bruni, stepped forward and said loudly, We planned a hearth shift for the child. We have embers. The landlord swung the torch. Show me. Bruni pulled at the blanket edge and exposed a shallow bowl of charcoal glowing low, kept warm with cloth and careful tending. The landlord nodded once, then turned his torch toward Marta and the pallet. He crouched, his boot soles scraping, and peered into the shadow beneath the pallet. For a heartbeat, Marta felt the room contract. Every breath held was an accusation. The landlord's palm knocked the burlap and Pete rustled. What's this? He asked, but the question was aimed to trap rather than to learn. Marta stepped forward and put her palm flat on the burlap as if feeling for heat. She kept her voice steady. Leftover packing? Nothing for the bake. The landlord's eyes scanned her face and then Agnes'. He sniffed the air and a small smile of triumph touched his lip. He liked finding proof of hoarding. He reached to pull the sack free. At that instant a child's cry pierced the room, not sleep's cough but a sudden, panicked sob. The neighbor on the pallet cried, Ida's up, she's hot, she needs closer heat. The landlord's hand hesitated. Agnes seized that pause and pushed her other hand against Marta's wrist. There was a tremor in her grip that said she might faint if the peat was taken. Marta looked at the landlord and then at the child's face, flushed and sweating under thin linen. She made a decision that had been forming since the oven-master left. She would risk accusation to keep warmth where it mattered most. Take what you need for the bake, Marta, and the attic folded silent around her words. The landlord blinked as if the choice surprised him. Marta felt the room hold its breath, but not that sack. She added, voice low, that is for Ida. Jory reacted as if the offer had burned him. You can give it away, Marta. That's not yours to give. Marta met him without flinching. You offered coin for coal. I refuse that coin until Eda rests. Her refusal was a small defiance, and it landed with the weight of a practical law. She deflected Jory's demand and made the landlord's enforcement a matter of conscience instead of ledger. Jory spat on the floor. "You'll allow me. Maybe I will, martyr." Aigen's shoulders sank. She pressed a hand to Edda's forehead and murmured, "Forgive me." The landlord scratched his jaw and considered the room, as if choosing which trouble to carry downstairs. He had the power to evict a single cot or to seize fuel for the bakehouse. In either case he would gain a small advantage and leave a small pile of ruin behind. After a long, careful look he made a choice that revealed his calculation. "I'll leave the sack tonight," the landlord said. "You keep it warm. But if I find any near morning missing from the bakehouse stores, one family goes." His voice was flat. The threat was concrete and immediate. A hush followed. It was not reprieve but the narrow band of time before consequence. Bruni swallowed and rubbed his knuckles on his trousers. Marta felt the landlord's torchlight on her face and the peat under her hand as if both were weights to be shifted. She had bought the child's safety with a promise that could be kept or broken by tomorrow's light. The oven master returned at the first grey edge of dawn with his ledger and a short temper. He demanded a tally, and the landlord accounted aloud. Marta listened and counted the cold arithmetic in her head while she watched Edda's breath ease beneath the blanket. The oven master's ledger might as well have been a drumbeat. Figures, quantities, demands. Marta answered each count with a simple headshake and a hand on the bowl of embers to warm Edda's feet. When the oven master barked, "If I find more missing, there will be fines," Marta nothing. Her hands kept the child's toes warm. By the time light filled the window, the attic had rearranged itself into a new order. Neighbors had shifted beds so Edda lay in the center, blankets overlapping like small walls. They had arranged the last peat into a shallow pile against the pallet and kept a small, steady flame burning in a metal bowl. Agnes sat with her back to the wall and steadied herself against exhaustion. Jory paced near the doorway, restless and muttering about labor and debts. Marta knelt by Edda, hands careful and methodical, and felt the child's pulse at the wrist. Her suspicion had become something different now, a protective attention that sifted what to do next. An external noise came. A shout from the alley where a cart's wheel had struck a stone. Everyone turned. For a few breaths the possibility of a new disturbance hung in the air. It passed without consequence, and in that minute a small twist occurred, a reveal that no one expected. Bruni, who had been quiet all night, pushed forward and said, "I found a small ration in my bag. Left it from when my sister sent it. We can mix it with the peat and keep the fire longer." The attic reacted as if a new coal had been added to the embers. Shoulders eased, a few sharp lines of worry smoothed. This surprise shifted the stakes. What seemed like a narrow, binary choice earlier now had an extra margin. Marta nodded her head fast and firm. "Bring it." She spoke to Bruni and to the room as a single listener. Bruni added the ration to the bowl and stirred the embers with a twig. The flame licked steadier and the smoke ran up the rafters in a thin, controlled ribbon. The landlord watched, counting the cost in his head. He adjusted his torch and asked, "Who will tend it?" There was a pause while people glanced at one another. Marta answered, "I will. At first light, I will fetch whatever small fuel we can spare and split it." Jory spoke sharply then, "What about my coin?" Marta looked at him and said, "You will have work. I will mend your net. But not for the coin. You will see the child safe first." He snorted, displeased and moved by the delayed repayment. Agnes leaned forward and whispered, "Thank you, Marta." Her voice was small and raw. Marta did not answer with feelings. She replied with a concrete promise. "I'll be at the wharf by noon. Bring the net." That public exchange resolved some tension and stoked another. Jory's pride had been checked in public, and he would either escalate tomorrow or accept the obligation. The oven master left with the landlord at last, but not without an inventory and a formal note pinned to his coat. They walked down the stair, and the door closed with a sound like a verdict. Inside, the attic rearranged itself into tasks. Women boiled thin broth and spooned it into the child's mouth. Men sat with tools and patchwork. Agnes slept with her head on Marta's knee for a little while, a concession to exhaustion and relief. Marta kept her eyes open, counting heartbeats, watching embers. Her suspicion had finally turned into a worn kind of trust. Small, conditional, and governed by the immediate need to keep Edda breathing steadily. Later, when light had warmed a corner of the floor, Marta rose and went to the small chest, where she kept a folded scarf and a leather-bound notebook with accounts of trades and favors scribbled inside. She found the page with Jory's name and added a line, net mend before noon, coal for child tonight, debt to honor. The entry was a piece of practice as well as record. Marta believed in lists because they kept promises measurable. Agnes watched her and said, "You could have taken the coin." Marta folded her scarf with slow hands and answered, "Taking the coin would have kept my hands from earning tomorrow." "I'm not sure either is kinder." She touched the child's forehead and felt the slow fall of Edith's breath. Midday came with a small, sharp weather change, a wind pushing sleet against the window. Marta went to the wharf, hands steady though the reins of worry tightened her fingers. She found Jory by the boats, net in hand, and they spoke with short sentences and sharper edges. "Jory, Marta, you have work for me." "Bring your needle," he answered. "You mend, then you will see coin if work is proper." They traded few words and let the work itself be the speech. Marta set to mending with quick, practiced fingers. The net took shape under her hands. Jory watched, restless. Once he said, "You could have taken what you need without this." Marta replied, "And what would that teach?" Her hands did not stop moving. They did not finish their talk. The exchange of labor replaced argument with movement. When Marta returned with the repaired net folded in her arms, the attic had changed again. Ada slept with a calmer face. The embers fed on the ration Bruni had shown. Agnes stood by the window and stared at the pale street, as if memorizing it. Jory came in a few minutes later, coin heavy in his palm, but his face had softened in a way that suggested he had decided to accept the delayed transaction. He pressed the coin into Agnes's hand with a grunt and a short, near, awkward, "For the child." Agnes looked at Marta and gave a brief smile. Marta kept her face even, but inside she catalogued each small favor and paid debt. Her ledger did not live only on paper. By evening the landlord passed again, this time lighter in demeanor. He had spoken to the ovenmaster and received a report that muddled blame and spared eviction for the moment. He tapped his torch against the stair as if testing the wood and then said, "I'll be round in 2 days. Keep your accounts straight." A threat with time attached was easier to hold than one with sudden action. Marta felt that and translated into steps. Gather, divide, and account. The attic breathed with a new steadiness while Edda slept. Neighbors' small stories to fill the long night, how a mother had wrapped calves in wool, how a baker had traded a loaf for a blanket. Quiet things that named where favors came from. Marta listened and added to her private list. Late that night, when the embers had shrunk and the room's talk had thinned to whispers, the ovenmaster returned alone and held a scrap of paper. He read an entry aloud from the ledger and then paused, eyeing Marta. There was a turf gone from the store, but another ledger shows a ration left. Seems the tally's balanced this time. Marta breathed as if she had been holding air for hours. She watched the ovenmaster fold the paper and tuck it behind his belt and realized that the ledger, like a knife, could be used either to wound or to bind people. She thought of all the hands that had touched that night. Agnes' quick fingers, Bruni's quiet donation, Jory's unwilling coin, the landlord's torch, and her own stubborn refusal to let Edda go cold. The small community had shifted. Bargains had been struck and reputations rearranged. Marta recorded the facts in her head, concrete and clean. A sack of peat hidden, a child's fever, a coin offered and deferred, a net mended, a landlord's conditional mercy. She closed the night on a single action. She fed the embers with a careful hand and smoothed the child's blanket around Ida like a small shelter. The last ember curled and held, and Marta leaned back against the pallet and let her eyes rest on faces softened by sleep. Her suspicion had led to watchfulness, fear had made her urgent, and resignation had settled into practical generosity. These shifts had moved the room through danger to a fragile agreement. Dawn found Marta tying a small bundle for Jory's work and scribbling a short note to the oven master, a promise to account for any missing ration if needed. She left the attic with the knowledge that conflicts were settled tonight but not erased. The ledger would return, and so would demands. Before she stepped out into the street, she knelt by Ida and touched her hand. Ida's breath was steady. Marta straightened and walked down the stair with the net folded under her arm and the day's tasks ahead. She had traded a possible quiet life for the certainty of doing right where it mattered. It would cost her labor and perhaps reputation, but it kept a small chest from breaking. At the doorway, Marta paused and turned back once, watching Agnes crease a blanket over the child's face and Bruni stir the embers. The landlord's torchlight had been a threat and a bargain. Jory's coin had been offered and accepted with a delayed return, and the ovenmaster's ledger had been both a danger and a tool. Marta kept the image of the pallet and the peat in her mind as a record of choices made under pressure. She stepped out into street air that smelled of coal and wet wood and walked toward the wharf knowing she had kept a child warm for another day. The chapter closed on a concrete, small action. Marta handing Jory a repaired net and promising, with an inked mark in her notebook, to bring fuel shares by the week's end. That promise was a binding thing the neighbors could count on, and the room below would wake to the embers still faint in the bowl.